everyone, welcome to my tutorial on the old-fashioned baby bonnet pattern. Say that 10 times fast. I've made this pattern several times before, including in a cherry print to match the Franny baby outfit, but I haven't had the time to film it yet, so here we go. You'll cut out 2 of the A pattern pieces on the fold. This is the main part of the bonnet. You'll also cut out 2 of the pattern B pieces, and this is the back of the bonnet. And then finally you'll cut out 2 of the bonnet brims. At least you'll cut out 2 for the bonnet that I'm making, which is view 2. Pretty simple, right? So view 2 comes with an embroidery design on the pattern pieces, and if you wanted to do the embroidery work, sorry, Audrey's helping me with this voiceover. She's sleeping less and less these days, and there's only so much time in the day. So anyway, if you wanted to do the embroidery work, now would be the time to trace the pattern on with a water-soluble marker and get to stitching. I was making this bonnet last minute for the local Easter hat parade here in Dillsboro, North Carolina, so I skipped that. On a side note, you may know that we just moved, and I found out last minute that Dillsboro has this adorable little Easter hat parade thing. I thought, how much fun would that be to go to the parade? And of course, she needs to have a bonnet to wear for the Easter hat parade. Right? I know. Okay, so it's highly likely that you'll want to interface your fabric. And I'm sitting here trying to think of a fabric type that won't require interfacing for a bonnet, and I really can't think of any. So yes, don't be lazy and get to interfacing. It does make a huge difference, and I'll show that later in the video. I know. So you interface. You'll want to do this with all 3 pieces of your good fabric. I am self-lining, but if you weren't lining with the same fabric, then you'll want to interface your good fabric, not your lining fabric. From there, take one of the pattern pieces, A, and sew along the back little edge. Audrey. This edge will go down the back of the child's head. I use 3/8 inch seams. The extra 1/8 inch is not that big of a difference from the suggested 1/4 inch seams from the pattern, but it provides a bit more security in my mind. After pressing that seam open, I ran 2 rows of gather stitches from one side of that little back seam to the other side of that little back seam. And the idea here is that the permanent stitches will go in between the 2 rows of gather stitches, and having 2 rows greatly helps when you're attaching this bonnet section to the back area. So you'll pull the gathers up, and then I started matching the bonnet back by putting it on the little back seam and pinning, and then I went straight across the circle, so kind of 180 degrees, and pinned that to the top of the bonnet. And then I went to the 90 degree and the 270 degree mark, so kind of splitting the difference between the top of the bonnet and the bottom seam, and attach a pin. Of course, none of this pinning needs to be super duper precise, but this method helps me distribute the fabric somewhat evenly, which makes the gathers look better. Once I get the back of the bonnet pinned to the main section, then I take that to my machine so you can sew around the circle. If your machine has an option of leaving the needle in the down position, you may find that helpful as you turn and stitch around the circle. I'll sort of stitch a section, turn my work, and continue stitching. Then I iron around the circle and pull out the gather thread that is showing. I guess you could pull out the other thread, but no one really knows it's going to be there except everyone watching this video. Finally, I trimmed up that seam before repeating the same process to the lining pieces. And take a look at the bonnet on my right hand compared to my left hand. The one on the right hand has interfacing, and the one on the left hand doesn't. And you can see how much nicer the one with the interfacing lays. You really can't skip this step when making a bonnet. I'm trying to emphasize this. Okay, off my high horse, and moving on to the little brim area. I decided to put some lace on it, but that's completely optional. I just put a bit of straight lace on the edge of the brim, but in all honesty, I should have gathered the lace. And to gather lace, just pull the little thread in the lace header. We had just moved, and I think my brain was just too stressed out to remember to gather lace. I don't know what I did, but anywho, I will show you how I fixed it later on. Of course, you could put some piping instead of lace, or some pretty ribbon. Again, all of these options are optional. Then I put the lining right sides together with the brim pieces, and sew with the previous stitches from the lining facing up so I could sew just inside those stitches. Then I trimmed up that seam, flipped the brim right sides out, and gave that a good pressing. Then I grabbed the bonnet body with the interfacing, so this is my good bonnet body, not my lining one. I laid the brim on top of the bonnet body with all right sides facing up. In other words, the bonnet's brim's wrong side will be touching the right side of the bonnet body. I hope that makes sense. You'll want to leave a little gap on each end, and this will be for the seam allowance in the next step. Go ahead and stitch all the way around that brim area. So finally, put the good bonnet right sides together with the lining bonnet. You'll stitch all the way around the bonnet except for a small gap. And I started this seam at the bottom of the bonnet so my gap would be down there, less noticeable. As you can see, I start at the bottom, stitch across, turn the corner, and stitch up the brim area and turn the other corner. And then I stitch over, but then I stop to leave that gap, 2 to 3 inches wide or so. After trimming up the corners and the seam allowance, then reach into that gap and turn the bonnet right sides out. At this point, your bonnet will look like a hot mess until you push those corners out and give everything a really good ironing. So everything needs to be licked from the iron here, especially my bonnet since I'm using linen. But how lovely is linen, even if it is a little bit of a high maintenance fabric. So lastly, I understitch the brim to help it lay flat. And these stitches won't be shown since the brim will lay over them. Okay, so if your baby likes to wear hats and bonnets, just go ahead and finish the traditional way with the ribbon tie enclosure. However, Audrey does not like to wear hats or bonnets or anything on the little poor child's head. We are still working out the details on this one. It's a negotiation. So instead of the ribbon, I took a piece of elastic and then a scrap piece of fabric that was longer than elastic by a few inches. I folded the piece of fabric in half, stitched along, and trimmed up the seam allowance, and then turned that right sides out using the threads from the seam. So I didn't trim the threads, that way I could use them to thread a needle and turn the pieces right sides out. This basically just saves me the step of having to, secure a piece of thread onto this, but either method works. Then I use a safety pin to thread the elastic through this little bit of fabric. When the elastic got to the end of the first side, I took it to my machine and did a zigzag to enclose the raw edges and attached it to the bonnet. The zigzag will be hidden later by a button, so don't worry about that. So I continued to push the elastic through until it got to the other side. I used some tweezers to fold the raw edges of the fabric down into the little casing, if you will, and then took that to my machine. It's not a casing, but you know what I'm talking about. Just down into the insides. My mommy brain is not working for me right now, but just push it down. And then I took that to my machine and did a handful of small stitches to secure the elastic in place. So from there, I began my handwork. Now first, I straightened out this lace issue that I mentioned before. I took some lightweight thread and went through the lining once and came back to create a loop, and then I wrapped my needle around that loop twice and pulled tight, and the loop sort of cinches down to create a knot. And so that's how I tie on. And now that I was tied on, I went up the right side of the bonnet towards the outside of the lace. I just followed the outside area of the lace, making tiny stitches around to secure the bonnet, and this leaves the lace lying flat and looking lovely again. So now that crisis was over, I know it's stressful, I attached one mother of pearl button to each side of the bonnet. Again, I tied on with that loop method, going through the lining once, coming back to create a loop, and going through the loop twice and pulling tight to tie on. Then I attached the button so it would cover up the zigzag area. When I was done stitching the button on, I tied off with the same loop method and slipped my needle between the lining and bonnet for an inch or so. This way the tail of that thread will be hidden, and then I snipped the thread loose. So to close the back gap area, I double threaded a needle. You'll see here both ends of the thread are going through this needle's eye, and that allows me to tie on using a loop as you're seeing here. So if you're gathering, I've come to despise those little tails over the years that just pops up all over the garment, and I feel it makes it look like it's just more tidy this way, okay? There's worse things, but there's just more tidy this way. So I really like this method. Okay, so then I go from one side over to the next side, up inside the fabric, out so you can go over to the next side, up inside the fabric, out so you can go to the next side of the fabric, and I just keep repeating this until I close that gap. I prefer stitching like this as opposed to a whip stitch or something like that, since the stitches are hidden, so it's just a cleaner look. And then I tie off in the same manner, again, sending my needle between the lining and bonnet fabric so I can hide the tail. So finally, I attached a snap to close the bonnet with, but that was a joke. Audrey quickly got the bonnet off. I mean, it was just like, it was without even blinking. The thing was on the floor, okay? And then I thought, well, what about a hook and eye? And that worked perfectly. I wish we had some video of this, because really, she just tugged on the bonnet a few times and then lost interest when it didn't come off. Like I said, I wish we would have filmed it, but it really was that simple. There was no fussing or anything like that. She didn't cry, nothing. So here is Audrey enjoying the Easter hat parade in Dillsboro, North Carolina. She wore that bonnet all day without any issues, including through lunch. So in all total, that was around 3 hours or so. Like I said, she tugged a little bit at the beginning, and that was it. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I will do my best to answer them. As always, I appreciate y'all for watching, and I hope to catch y'all next time.